Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Ali Heppenstall and I'm Executive Director of Climate Action for Associations. This is a Climate Action for Associations discussion based around future food systems as part of New York Climate Week or Climate Week NYC. Today, joining me, I have Tessa Lee, who's from the Climate Group, who run Climate Week New York. Emily Shankar from the Sustainable Restaurant Association, Ursula Arens from the representing the British Dietetic Association, and Liz Bentley from the Royal Meteorological Society. And what I'm going to do first off is just give a little outline about climate action for associations. So as you know, climate action for associations, we specialize in supporting membership organizations, both on the professional body side and trade association side in the acceleration to net zero. We help them get their own house in order and also to support the members, the industries and professions they represent and the different sectors and systems. These types of discussions are pretty free-flowing and they're all about helping other associations with their own journey. So we look at informing and inspiring and encouraging debate and educating, but above all, it's about just showcasing the great work that membership organizations are doing to accelerate towards net zero. Tess, I'm going to come straight to you if that's all right. How's Climate Week New York going, and what's shaking in that part of the world?
Sure. Good morning, everybody from New York City. So happy to be here from representing the Climate Group. This is Climate Week's 14th year. Last year, obviously, we had a quick pivot to a fully virtual event. This year, we've had some hybrid, mostly virtual, as well as in person. For those of you who maybe haven't even heard of Climate Week before, it's a big kind of hybrid event. The Climate Group, we put on kind of a core hub of conference, but then this year I think we have 530 events taking place, such as the one where we are all convened today here on this panel under the umbrella of Climate Week. We hold it every year alongside the UN General Assembly in New York because, you know, when we launched Climate Week 14 years ago, it was with the goal to really make sure that climate was on the agenda of those government negotiations and those conversations among world leaders. And I think we've seen that this past April, the White House, the Biden administration invited us to hold US Climate Action Week as part of the United States recommitment to the Paris Agreement. We launched an ambitious new NDC. So we see this week as an opportunity to really keep the spotlight on climate, to have a lot of exciting announcements. I'm looking forward to the roundup of everything that comes out of the week that someone besides myself will put together. Then throughout the rest of the year, just quickly, the Climate Group, we have 3 business actions campaigns, which is the team I sit on, EP100 on energy productivity, RE100 for renewable electricity, and EV100 on electric vehicles. You'll notice none of those are food, but I'll talk more about that in a second. We've also got some work on steel, cement, supply chains, renewable thermal, and other things in the corporate space. And then we're the Secretariat for Under 2, which is a global network of subnational governments, so like states and regions, like the state of New York, the state of California, and who are joining up to make their own climate commitments and emission reduction commitments, and so we convene that group. I'll pause there to throw it over to the rest of the panelists, but thanks everyone. Thanks CAFA for holding this event under Climate Week, and thanks everybody for being here today.
Thanks, Tessa. Liz, do you want to go next and give a bit of an intro?
Yeah,
from your perspective?
Great, thanks, Ali. Delighted to be here also. So I'm Liz Bentley and I run the Royal Meteorological Society, which is the learned and professional body for weather and climate in the UK. So obviously we have an interesting climate, as you would imagine. We have a number of members who engage with weather and climate. So if we're thinking about the food sector, we will have many of our members who are delivering weather services to the food sector and agriculture sectors on a kind of short scale, so next few days, seasonal type forecasts. But we also have a group of our members who are very much focused on climate change and working in the climate science arena. And a lot of those members of the Royal Met Society have been involved in a number of big reports that have come out. So whether they're reports for the UK, so earlier this summer, the climate change risk assessment, the third risk assessment came out in the summer this year, very much focused on a look at the UK government and the risks relating to climate change in the UK. And that has a significant chunk section on food security in the UK. And then other climate scientists will be involved with international reports. So again, another big IPCC report came out last month, the 6th assessment report. But I'll take you back to one of the special reports that came out at the end of 2019, which focused on land. And again, there's a lot of information there and a chapter on food security as well. So I represent, I guess, the group of people who are looking at the science of climate science, but how it impacts on different sectors, and happy to talk about the food sector today. So we're a small organisation, we're a not-for-profit organisation, and we don't do any research and we don't do any weather forecasting. We're really here to facilitate, to help scientists publish their science, share their science, advance the science, to support those working in the profession. So, for example, you could work to become a chartered meteorologist, and that's something the Royal Met Society will oversee. So, yeah, just a brief summary of what we do.
Fantastic, Liz. Ursula, can I come to you next? Share more about the BDA.
I'm one of 10,000 members of the British Dietetic Association, and our profession is mainly clinical. Most dietitians work in some way within medical services, so hospitals, clinics, etc. Sustainability is a relatively new subject for dietitians, but thinking about it, it's probably actually a relatively new subject for everyone, because, you know, it's a sort of a recent agenda item for many industries. And dietitians have thought that increasingly we need to expand the basis of the dietary advice we're given beyond just the medical aspects of food advice, looking at health and disease risk, etc., to looking at other aspects of food choice, specifically environmentally sustainable diets. So we've had a sort of, as a profession, a very steep learning curve. But as I say, again, I think that's true for many, many other groups. I don't think we're alone in having to grapple with whole new areas. But we have been very active. And so we did have a policy on sustainable diet. Our first policy was 2013, and an updated policy in 2017. And in 2019, we produced a report called One Blue Dot, which was really specifically intended for dietitian readers, but was to be the basis by which dietitians then advise the general public on any queries they might have on what is the scientifically valid basis to make decisions on sustainable eating, because it is a confusing subject and there's full of contradictory, paradoxical information everywhere. So the public are confused, dietitians are confused, and the point of this report was just to try and pull together some starting basis for the advice that we want to give, want to receive.
Thanks, Ursula. And Emily, can I ask you to say hi? Tell us a bit more about the SRA.
Hello, yes, hi. My name is Emily. I'm a project manager with the Sustainable Restaurant Association, and we run the world's largest sustainability program for hospitality. It's called Food Made Good. So we launched with 50 member sites in 2010, and we've expanded to now more than 10,000 food service sites across the globe. So we're constantly growing, and we work with restaurants, cafes, pubs, workplace and university canteens. And we guide them, we assess them, we support them and inspire them to reach even higher standards of sustainability. And we do this mostly in three main ways. So first is our framework. This provides food businesses with kind of manageable means of understanding and reviewing and acting on about 10 key areas. And this is into three pillars. So it's sourcing, environment, and society. And this just emphasizes the need to focus on food that's well sourced, but as well as the impact of the people that are growing it, cooking and serving it, and of course on the planet. So that is our framework, and we use that framework to inform our sustainability rating, because what you can't monitor, you can't monitor what you haven't measured. And our rating assesses businesses' sustainability across the framework. So it accredits them on a 1, 2, or 3-star award, and then generates a report to help them identify where they're excelling and also where they can improve on the following year. And then we recognize and celebrate these individuals and businesses who are at the forefront of the sustainable food movement with an award ceremony yearly. So that is the main ways in which we contribute to our community. We have a global online community of hospitality professionals. It's a space where businesses can engage and to seek solutions to their biggest sustainability challenges, share successes, and just communicate with like-minded individuals to work towards the same goal. We also have various campaigns and projects that we run. Our One Planet Plate campaign engages with chefs globally to highlight their most planet-friendly dishes, and it inspires guests to know where to go to dine out wisely. We are also the delivery partner for Net Zero Now. So we're rolling out an accessible and affordable and of course credible means of guiding SME operators to become net zero. And then we work with a variety of projects. So my specialty is sustainable diets and nutrition as well. And I work on an EU life funded project that is aiming to engage UK and EU citizens to adopt sustainable and healthy diets. That hopefully will result in reduced carbon and water footprints. So we're at the later stages of that project. It'll be wrapping up in 2022, and hopefully we'll see replication across university and company canteens. So that is the long-term objective of that project.
Amazing, thanks, Emily. Can we talk a little bit about the supply demand side of food and the food systems for a minute? Because I personally, I guess, feel that the food side of climate and climate action is the one that I know least about, and I feel like it's almost the one that's probably not had as much airtime as the other areas, such as around emissions and energy efficiency and transportation, etc. And I'm wondering, is that because is there an element of food, because it's obviously so intrinsic to consumer behavior? Is there still a little taboo around it? I guess, is there some kind of controversy around food, that it's not necessarily got the same level of attention as other areas of climate risk, I guess? And I'm not sure who wants to kick off that.
I mean, I'll jump in, but I think maybe Ursula or Emily could speak to this. Ali, to your point, yes, I think food, land use, agriculture, partially because it's more complicated. And so, Ali, your question is kind of focused on that consumer, so the diets and restaurants and sustainable diets, which is very important, but there's so many upstream places where emissions can be reduced without ever asking people to change what they eat. So I'd love to speak to those, but maybe over to Emily or Ursula or Liz on kind of that personal choice aspect.
Yeah, can I just add? I think it is, because it is such a complex, as Tessa just said, it's such a complex. The whole linkage with for us, we look at both mitigation, so how the food chain and agriculture contributes to climate change and changes that need to be made, and that in itself is very complex. But then adaptation, so changes that we're already seeing because of climate change impacts that are happening already in the world, and the ongoing changes that we're likely to continue to see, is also very complex. So, there are some winners and losers in the food chain with climate change. There are some, you'll see crop yield increasing because of climate change in some parts of the world, and you'll see crop yield decreasing. And then you get these extreme weather events that will have a significant impact on the demand in the short term, so in a season. So it's extremely complex. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why it's quite hard to get a message across kind of succinctly about the whole of the food sector around climate change, because I don't think there is one headline message. There are multiple ones in there.
Yeah, and I guess that's mainly where the confusion arises as well. Sorry, Emily.
I was just going to add to that and say that is one of the challenges with the Suitable Life Project, especially, is that we are taking a salutogenic approach to our communications. So we're foremost telling people that a healthy diet is by definition a sustainable diet. So if you're eating healthy and eating right for your body, you're doing well for the planet, just by taking care of yourself. And I think that our communication, since it's always positive, and we firmly believe at the SRA that food is the single strongest lever, to quote the Eat Lunch Hot Commission, to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth. So we want to empower people to know that what you choose to put on your plate really does make a difference, and it has a substantial impact on the planet as well as your health. And I think that by providing that education from that positive light, as well as providing the tools of which to accomplish a sustainable diet on your own, that has been our focus. And yes, it is a challenge to break down the complexity for people. It certainly is. But I think that that's one of the methods that we can take, is by really empowering them to make those choices.
Well, I would just say it is complex. And one reason is that if you're looking at transport, for example, moving 100 kilograms from A to B, you can define that quite clearly. You can measure a carbon cost. You can compare a big truck with a small car and do a graph, and it's, reproducible data, it's measurable, etc. With food, there are a number of different systems that are the threatened environmental systems, one of which in discussion is carbon, and the carbon costs of producing food, of transporting food, and carbon equivalent effects of things like methane, which ruminants produce that are warming. So that's one, but there are about 7 or 8 or 9 other criteria that are involved, and they are fuzzy. So, for example, biodiversity is not one measure in one place at one time. It's simply the pyramid shapeness of different species, and you can track, indicators of biodiversity, but it's not a single measure that you can easily compare South America with Japan and say, here's the score. So these are incredibly important concepts, but they are fuzzy data. And so they are not neat, they're not precise methodology, and it's very hard to compare them directly, but they need to be incorporated in considering dietary advice. And another one, for example, is fish stocks. I mean, fish stocks has nothing to do with carbon. It's not a carbon issue, it's not a global warming issue, but obviously fish stocks are under massive threat because we are so efficient at hoovering up the oceans. So to some degree, environmental aspects need to provide a basis for public advice and decisions on what kinds of fish and how much fish and where that fish is from, which is not in any way linked to carbon, which is the usual kind of parameter of global warming and carbon. So as I say, food is fuzzy and complicated, but nonetheless, it is so important that we do need to simply agree this is better, this is worse in terms of directions of travel. And we need to be consistently supportive of decisions that are the better decisions, even if it's kind of frustratingly imprecise data at times.
Yeah, but I completely agree. It's super complicated, but I mean, from a personal level, because lots of folks come to me and ask about climate advice, I think the number one thing is don't waste. Don't waste food once it's made it to your refrigerator. That's true also for point of sale. That's true for corporate cafeterias. But then for folks in the food supply chain, and surprisingly for folks, so again, more at the corporate level than at the individual kind of eater and human consumer level, there's so many levers that we can push on. I have the luxury, to Ursula's point, of really just looking at emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, which water, biodiversity, all these other things are critical. But along the food and agriculture supply chain, you can start, with soils, with different feed for livestock to reduce that methane from enteric fermentation. You look at waste, whether it's manure or crop residuals, can you be, instead of off-gassing from anaerobic digestion, can you capture that? Are there waste to energy projects that can be installed? From there, a lot of food has a heat load, often low or medium temperature. So can we electrify natural gas heat? Can we use some of that waste to energy, to burn it directly for a thermal load? On to transport, can we have more efficient transport modes? Can we switch to electric vehicles for things? There's a lot of refrigeration and cold chain in food. So what refrigerants, how efficient are your refrigeration things? You can look at packaging for transport. Can you reduce the waste of your packaging? That's that much less gas is required. Can you take water out of a food product? Again, that will reduce your transportation costs and associated carbon emissions. So there's so many places where emissions can come out of food without even changing the product itself. Now, again, we need to move to eating less meat or things like that have a huge climate impact, but there's so many places we can start to reduce emissions without even changing the product beyond, switch to renewable electricity, but electricity is a low percentage of the overall food, but there's so many other technologies where emissions can be cut. And if you're a corporate who's procuring food or a corporate association, you have some levers to start to make those requests. And, or even if you're not, things like transport, things like refrigeration, where can we start to make corporate commitments, which ties it back to our hundreds campaigns. But again, for food, is there an association or commitment on refrigeration? So what refrigerants are actually in your cold chain, the chemicals that are in those cooling coils have huge global warming potential, and there's a huge spread. So taking a look at that, taking a look at the efficiency, the energy efficiency of your products. And so whether you have cold chain for food or for something else, where can we, as again, for CAFA, we're looking at associations. So where are these commonalities, these common technology uses, and that we can start to join together to procure, and products or, options, invest in technologies that reduce emissions from this whole swath of things: transport, refrigeration, soil use, waste to energy. I mean, there's so many options. And that's where we start to see, to Emily's point, what gets measured gets managed. So starting with the commitment is always my advice for whatever it is for a corporation. Make a commitment, even if you don't know how you're going to get there. And it's the same thing I think for humans in our households, commit to, if it's eating less meat or if it's not throwing away your groceries, make that commitment and then work against it. So I think I'm optimistic. We're at early days in investigating food here at the Climate Group, but from the corporate side, there's so much to be done.
I think, and Tessa, I think there's fantastic examples there, but I think it goes back to your original point, Ali, that that it is very complex, and so the solutions are there's loads of opportunities. So I think, but there isn't one silver bullet that's magically going to sort out the food sector, and hence that makes it quite complicated as a kind of conversation point, which goes back to your original question.
Yeah, and with a lot of personal preferences wrapped into that as well, obviously, and once you start to overlay that with cultural preferences, global, it becomes really, really confusing, and the media obviously plays a really strong role in confusing us even further. But Liz, I just want to draw on some of the actual work that some of your members do in around the from a science-based perspective around soil and land use, etc. And you were explaining to me earlier this week around actually weather patterns being the opposite to what the media often suggests.
Yeah, I gave you an example of how the cold weather spells that we'd had in Europe and North America earlier this spring. When we talk about climate change, we talk about temperatures increasing and we talk about rainfall patterns changing. We very rarely talk about cold extreme events happening. And we had a couple this year that have heavily impacted on the food industry. So there was some really extreme frost events that were happening in France, and a polar vortex event that came down pretty much all the way down across North America earlier in the year. And obviously the impact that had on the wine industry in Europe. And I remember pictures of fires being lit next to in the vineyards next to the vines, just to try and reduce the kind of impact of frosts, and again the impact that it's had on a number of crop production in North America because of this. And there's a lot of discussion going on in the science community about are we likely to see these extreme cold events because of climate change, or are they going to become less frequent? And so there's been quite a lot of research done about the warming that we're seeing in the Arctic is about 3 times greater than the warming that we're seeing kind of averagely across the rest of the world. And so you're reducing that temperature contrast from equator to pole, because the Arctic's warming more than, say, the tropical regions. And by reducing that temperature contrast, you start to see weather patterns changing different. We get these different changes in weather systems, and we start to see these colder events penetrating further south than they may be normal. So we could see some extreme cold events even moving forward in. And it's really interesting because we tend to focus on extreme heat, droughts, flooding, but again, there's a discussion there about whether we may see some more extreme cold events happening again as we saw this spring, and do we have to factor that in as well?
Yeah, that's super interesting. Emily, from your perspective and your initiative in terms of this supply chain, how is the hospitality industry coping with pressures in relation to these types of challenges, but also, I guess, some of the areas that Tessa just raised as well around refrigeration and trade and all the other elements of the supply chain? What's the biggest pressure points in your community?
Sure. I think in terms of the supply chain, it's been a challenge with COVID, especially in the past couple of years. We've seen businesses saying that they're having to increase their prices just to cover the expense of the food costs increasing. I think that we talk a lot about high welfare animal products, especially. So that's a key focus in the supply chain, especially in the UK. We're very blessed with a climate that caters well to grazing animals. So we're always trying to make sure that the meat is as local as it can be, local to the UK, grass-fed. I think that is probably the biggest point of focus for our restaurants is high welfare products. But in addition, they're always trying to do seasonality. So that usually lends way to local produce. And if not, we usually just recommend produce from within Europe, because that way it's most likely sent on a train or boat and it's not airlifted into the UK. So I think that just the embracing of seasonality on our restaurants' menus is really key. And then they're able to get local produce that's always lovely and fresh all year round. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. Thanks, Emily. So what can businesses do internally to support their, even as far as employees and employee engagement and shifting habits and mindset? Who wants to pick up on that?
I mean, I think to Emily's point, education around things like seasonality. I'm sure Ursula has lots of insights into that connection between healthy diets and sustainable diets. I always come back to the first piece being don't waste. Because by the time every emission from the fertilizer, the soil, the crops, the waste, the transport, the refrigeration, and then to have food not even be eaten, whatever the calories consist of, and so that's just the easiest piece, I think, for any individual person, is to not let any food go in the garbage without being eaten, to work with groceries and point of sale, both from the supplier side and the corporate side, from the restaurants to work with their suppliers, to see where they can cut waste. So if it's using ugly produce, things like that, using broken pieces, missized pieces, being more willing to prevent food going in the trash after it's been packaged and shipped and washed and grown and everything else. And I think that that's a real place where businesses can take action. And then how we manage food waste. So composting, businesses have an opportunity, restaurants, corporate cafeterias, to work with their municipalities where they're located and see what kind of composting or waste management programs can be set up, things like that. In New York, we have a really cool program. COVID obviously disrupted this, but picking up leftover conference food. I mean, we've all been at conferences and seen huge amounts of leftover things, redistributing that to members of the community in need. How can we change food safety laws to keep us safe in our municipalities, but also allow for less food to go to waste and food to go to places in need? So I think there's a real opportunity at a municipal level for restaurants, for businesses, conferences, corporates, as well as private citizens to engage with to get educated on what rules are in place around food, particularly on preventing food from going to waste, and then, to advocate and to see where change is available.
Tessa, another question, I guess, with you, from your experience, are you seeing an increased regulation around sustainability and food and systems, or is the increased regulation more around the supply chain just generally?
So regulation comes up a lot. Historically, I've been in the climate and sustainability space for a long time, not just food. I think there's a sense that the private sector is antagonistic to environmental regulations. And one of the things we try to do, whether it's renewable electricity or food, land use, is show that there's a chunk of, particularly to Liz's points around weather changes, the private sector is aware of the risks and also the need to do something about climate change. And so when we can bring business leaders to say, we've already committed, they actually would like the certainty and they'd like regulations to support their climate commitments and to, whether it's bring costs down, to provide certainty, make everybody level the playing field. And so that's a lot of my work, again, on renewable electricity, but it's the same thing you see in food, is where corporates actually want regulation and want certainty and want governments to make the same net zero and emission reduction commitments that corporates are making, 2030 targets. Food, the trickiest part on food, I think, is when you go back to land use and particularly forestry. So on the under two side at the climate group, we do have particularly in South America and Amazonia, we have a number of state members who are quite heavily forested states. Also California, states that have a large agriculture. And so how we regulate around land use and forestry and that that very first part of the food supply chain is quite complicated, but we are seeing our state and region members advocate for stronger federal policy, work with the major corporations, the industries that are located there, to make sure that this is on the table and that policy is aligned with corporate needs. So I think there's a huge role that regulation can play, even in the private sector. I'm lucky enough to work with the leading companies there's a long tail. There's bad actors out there. There's companies, who are not falling in line and who are, quite frankly, acting quite negatively environmentally in pursuit of their business model, their business as usual, their profits. So I work with the leaders and the folks who see the value in going green and reducing emissions, and together we want to work with policymakers to, prevent those bad actors, set up regulations, incentivize change, et cetera. But I think there's a real opportunity for regulation, and we're seeing it in the pipeline. So smart companies know that these regulations are coming as well, and these policies are coming. So they want to get ahead of that, or they want to be aligned with that.
Great. And Ursula, thinking about the initiatives that BDA have been running, what can employers do to support their employees make the right decisions?
Well, I suppose what employers can do is help clarify and demystify the blizzard of contradictory information out there, and it's quite hard to do. And in fact, we're in the sort of early days of various groups looking at producing labeling on products and scoring them from A to D or red to green or whatever to help consumer choices, but they're finding it incredibly difficult. And as I say, as soon as you highlight one feature, someone says, but what about this? For example, is it more environmentally friendly to have a very tiny piece of chicken, or to have a big bowl of carrots that you've boiled for 2 hours to make them soft? Which, if you're comparing it, which is better, which is worse? And the answer is you can't, because it's different issues. But I'm thinking of sort of 4 key messages. And the first one is the one that Tessa has mentioned several times, which is waste reduction. Obviously, waste reduction at the consumer end, at the staff canteen end, all the way down the food chain. Food wastage is huge, and almost part of the difficult issue is that food, relatively speaking, is relatively cheap. Compared to past history, it's cheaper than it's ever been in terms of percentage of our income. And because it's cheap, the cheaper something is, the more waste. And if food was to become more expensive, chances are, without doing anything, we would waste less. But waste reduction is a real issue, because all of the energy and all of the assets you need to grow food is lost if it's not consumed. Second message, very simple: reduction in animal protein and increase in plant protein. That's the message. Not going into complex debates about, is beef better or worse than lamb, or what about chicken, or what about boiling it or frying it? You can go into all of that, but at the end of the day, the more complexity you add, the more everyone just gets confused. So less animal protein, and it's not saying no animal protein at all. We're not advocating complete veganism, but just less, and replacement with plant protein foods. It doesn't have to be the incredibly high-tech meat substitute products. It can be, and it should be, beans and lentils and nuts and all of those natural plant proteins. Message number 3, reduction in air freighted foods, because obviously per calorie or per nutrient, flying strawberries from far away to insist that you have them at Christmas is ridiculous. Strawberries are ripe 2 months a year. That's when you consume them. You don't have to have all foods available all through the year. And the fourth message is drinking tap water or tea or coffee as opposed to bottled drinks, be it water, be it any other kind of drink, because there's a huge energy cost in the distribution of fluids all over the country, and the plastic and the cans and all of that. So tap water is fine. I prefer my tap water flavored with a few tea leaves to it, and that's a bit of energy cost with boiling the water, but overall, as a water from a tap or tea or coffee, as opposed to sort of bottled waters. So those are the kind of 4 messages, and they would apply equally to the consumer as the employer. in terms of starting points that are just clear and consistent messages. And as I say, you can then have other debates about what about this or that, but that's maybe for another day.
Emily, the points that Ursula raised and your ratings system as part of the Food Made Good, are any of those resonating? Do they carry across? And also the areas around less wastage, etc. I would imagine in your certification, you're covering all sorts of different areas.
Yes, absolutely. So just to kind of recap some of the points that she made, our framework does include more veg and better meat. So we also want to see less meat on the menus. We encourage chefs to make vegetarian options available at the top of the menu, not necessarily in a different section where people, we want it to become a more normal thing to choose a vegetarian meal on a menu and not feel like you're making a specialty choice. We also want people to use local seasonal ingredients. We want them to rotate their menus. Like you said, no strawberries at Christmas time. Wasting no food is a huge part of our framework as well. And also sourcing fish sustainably. So I think that we're very much aligned on everything that you had said. Yeah.
Fantastic. With only 4 minutes to go, I feel like we almost need to start to do the infamous roundup. Liz, I'm gonna start with you. Just parting comments, obviously bearing in mind CAFA's remit in terms of supporting associations and also to showcase the great work that RMetS are doing. What's your takeaway?
Yeah, so again, there's a lot of information out there that the science is showing within the food sector. The reports I mentioned at the beginning of this session, the IPCC land report, some risk assessment reports that have come out recently. There's some really useful information about projections and impacts on crop yields, on impacts in the food security sector that I think it just provides food for thought. We spoke earlier in the week as well, Ali, and again, in the UK at the moment, we've got an energy crisis. So we've got, an issue with natural gas supply and increased demand. But what that's done is really open up, I think, an understanding of where we use, for example, CO2 in food production. And, the impact of a reduction in natural gas or the cost of natural gas is having on the CO2 use in animal, the slaughter process of animals and food packaging and how we kind of maintain longevity. And it's just been really interesting to have one particular area that then suddenly opens up knowledge of where, CO2, for example, is used within the food chain. And I think for me, one of the things that we do at the RMetS Society as well is very much education with children and schools. And I think just going back to basics, understanding where food comes from, encouraging people to grow your own food, just so that you have that knowledge and understanding of the food chain, appreciation of food, seasonality of food, I think is a real important area from an education perspective as well.
Thanks, Liz. That's really interesting. I didn't realise that you did the schools programs. That's fascinating. Ursula, parting comments.
Parting comment. I want to be really cheeky, and I just want to share and recommend a great book. It's called Food and Climate Change Without the Hot Air. It's written by Professor Sarah Bridle. This is entirely looking at the carbon aspect of food. So it's not going into everything else. It's just saying this is the measure, carbon. But she's an astronomical physicist, astronomy and physics, very, very clever lady. But she decided, I'm going to park that and go and look at food. And from her 2 or 3 years of looking at food, she's produced this definitively nerdy book. And it is absolutely the definitive quantification of carbon linked to food, and it's just a fantastic rock solid starting point to have a real solid basis on which to make recommendations. So not quite answering your question, but just wanted to share that.
All good, Ursula, and we'll include a link to the book when we do the post discussion wrap up in the email.
Thank you.
Thanks, brilliant. Emily, I'll come to you next.
Sure. I guess parting thoughts are that your choices make a difference. They make a really big difference, and by making really simple changes slowly over time, you can shift your diet to be one that's more sustainable. And something that we really try to emphasize in the UK is that it doesn't have to be expensive. It really doesn't. Buying some of the cheapest foods in the grocery store are sustainable choices. The dried legumes and the dried grains that you keep in your pantry, those, canned tomatoes, sure, canned isn't as sustainable as fresh sometimes, but that's not the case all the time. Buying local produce in the stores, that's going to be cheaper in the long run. Most of the time, that's cheaper than the tropical fruit that you see in the grocery stores, and it doesn't have the miles attached to it, and it tastes better, and it's better for you. So sometimes those choices, they're not always the most expensive choices in the store. So along with really believing that we as consumers have the power to make incredible change, we also believe that eating out can be good for everyone, and it can have a restorative impact on the planet. We can create a sustainable hospitality sector because there's quantity there. There's a large ability to make an impact with the hospitality professionals, and I think that's just really the message that I'd like to emphasize, is that it can be really easy, it can be really fun, it can be inexpensive. And I think that it is really up to us to create that message that really resonates with people and makes it easy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily. Completely agree. Just definitely down to us. And Tessa, I guess last words from New York Climate Week. What steps can businesses really take to reduce their food emissions, and parting comments from you?
Yeah, I mean, we had the UN report, we talk about the climate decade. Again, we have to act now. We are not in a good place. The science is quite alarming, and whatever your business, to Liz's points, when weather starts to get quite crazy, the risks are huge, the stakes are high for businesses and for human beings. And so I think really looking at all the options you have to reduce your emissions and looking at the levers and the influence that you have. I think corporations aren't necessarily cognizant always of the power that they have in their procurement choices. You may not be in the food industry, but again, all those technologies that I mentioned, you might be using some of them. We all use transport, we all use electricity and thermal loads. And, where can you start to reduce emissions? Where can you join together, aggregate your demand, aggregate your voice to policymakers, to your peers? That's why I love corporate associations, because we've already got this community of practice. And so how can those community of practices, those associations align to send a cohesive message, to send a louder message that, we demand the clean energy transition, we demand the transition to net zero, and it has to happen this decade. And so the food system, I think, is a really fascinating one, because we all eat food, we all touch it, we're all very familiar with it. We haven't all been to a cement manufacturing plant. That seems kind of disconnected from most of our lives, but no matter what your business is, we all eat food. And the emission sources, again, touch every point. It's energy, it's waste, it's chemical processes, it's land use. And so then whatever your business is, you can also plug into reducing emissions along one of those. And so I think my parting message is, don't be afraid to commit. A lot of times making a commitment is the first step to figuring out how. It shouldn't be the last, but say we have to do this. We have to reduce our emissions by 2030, go net zero, and start there. Don't be afraid to commit, and don't be afraid to join your voices together for kind of more powerful collective action. which is what we seek to do also with Climate Week, of course. But the time is now. There's no time to wait.
Yeah, absolutely, Tessa. No time to wait. And at CAFA, I'm proud to say as well, picking up on a very earlier point that you made, that we do have some of those associations that represent like refrigeration, food service equipment association. We've got heat pumps. We've got transportation and logistics as members. Gradually, we are compiling subgroups of systems across different associations that represent these areas in a similar way to how the climate group are breaking down its support to businesses in these different areas as well. But thank you very much for your time. We're 5 minutes over, but I think it was worth it. Liz, Emily, Tessa, Ursula, really appreciate it. And Sophie, who's running alongside us, who's managing the tech, thank you so much. And yeah, it's been a really good conversation and I'm really glad we had it. And thanks again and good luck for the rest of Climate Week NYC.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.